What I'm helping us to think about is our strategy. How do we imagine a world where food pantries and food charity isn't necessary? How can we move from a food charity model to a food justice model? And belonging is really a part of that. So what does participation look like? What does contributing look like, which is maybe a little bit further along than just participating, but actually contributing? That's a very critical moment for belonging.
Hello and welcome to the Digital Community Leaders Podcast, a conversation with community experts diving into their insights and leaving you with actionable ideas. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Susie Wise. Susie is the author for Design for Belonging, a professor at d.school and the director of strategy at Alameda County Community Food Bank. With over 2 decades of experience, Susie has dedicated her career to transforming educational landscapes by fostering creativity, collaboration, and equity. She is known for her ability to inspire and empower educators, students, and communities to think differently and embrace new ways of learning. She holds a Ph.D. in Learning Sciences from Stanford University, where she also served as a lecturer and a mentor. I'm delighted to say she's joining us today. I've been a big fan of the book for a while, and I had a chance to hear Susie speak at CMX earlier in the year. We're going to be talking to her about community and how good design impacts great community. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. This is the Digital Community Leaders Survey 2023. And this is the Digital Community Leaders Survey 2023 second edition. Back in 2023, we released a beautiful printed book. And due to its popularity, we sold out of printed copies. Rather than reprinting, we listened to your feedback and we included 40% more content in this copy. We created the report to be a data-backed handbook for building the foundations of your brand's community. For instance, did you know that 70% of communities we surveyed saw growth over the last 12 months? And we know those businesses are growing too. Other metrics we dive into include community growth, biggest pain points, community purpose, what are other community managers measuring, funding, participation, C-suite involvement, and much more. In this book, we present the data and expert insights from Richard Gott, Michelle Goodall, Vincent Boone, Keen Bakatari, Rosie Sherry, Matt Sullivan, Laura Roth, Nicole Saunders, Blaise Grimes-Vaught, and Jan Carlisle. We've also included frameworks such as the community archetypes, ecosystem of impact, community participation ladder, and the community first culture nexus. There's so much in here, I can't wait for you to get your hands on this new edition. You can order your printed copy from Amazon today or download a digital copy for free at digitalcommunityleaders.com. Hey, Susie, great to have you here. How's your day going?
Hey, Pete, it's great to be here. Hey, it's morning in California and it's starting off well. Got to hang out with my dog and now you. So all things are looking good.
I'm going to guess it's nice and sunny. It generally is in California.
Yeah, sometimes we get some fog, but today it is already sunny, yes.
Fab. Nice. And have you had a good summer? Have you managed to explore? Or have you been kind of just heads down working or?
Yeah, it's been, I'd say, a combination. I haven't had any like big trips, but I've taken some shorter ones, got some time totally off the grid, paddling on a river in Oregon. That was really fun. Made it to New York for a quick, like, long weekend. Been doing like shorter trips like that. I have an 18-year-old daughter and she's about to go to college, so we've been trying to do fun things together this summer.
That's really exciting. So for some context for those who are listening, Susie wrote a book a little while ago, and that's how I first became aware of Susie and her work. And I got this book, and it's not only is it full of great information, it's just beautifully designed. It's such a lovely book to have on the bookshelf, to the point where I've actually purchased a few copies of these for other folk. And I then had the chance to hear her speak at CMX in 2024, the beginning of 2024. And when I was planning out this season of the podcast, I was like, I would love to have Susie join us. So I dropped her an email and she was kind enough to find some time in her diary. So why don't we kick things off by saying Like, what are you up to now? So obviously you've got the book, and you've been at D.school and whatnot, but what's your main focus now?
Yeah, so my main focus right now is I'm the director of strategy at the Alameda County Community Food Bank.
Mhm.
So we distribute food across our county to 400 organizations. And what I'm helping us to think about is our strategy, not just in terms of distribution, but actually how do we imagine a world where food pantries and food charity isn't necessary?
Mm,
How can we move from a food charity model to a food justice model, and belonging is really a part of that. So for me, it's integrated. After the book came out, I knew that I needed a next place of deeper belonging, and that I wanted to do some local work in a new domain. A
mm,
lot of my prior work had been in education, both in higher education but also in supporting leaders in K-12 education, so through, in the US, high school
mhm.
educators. And that work was really exciting. And with the Design for Belonging book, I started to shift my focus, and I just knew I wanted to do something really local. So it's been really exciting to learn about this new domain and to kind of imagine how do we use the tools of design actually
Mm.
to engage folks that care about our neighbors that are food insecure to get to a place where we're beyond having to have food pantries to hand out food.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We have in the UK, like I'm sure many places around the world, we have food banks, and ours are generally organised by an organisation called the Trestle Trust. And I've had a chat with a few of the local food banks who we support generally around Christmas time and whatnot. And it's always interesting hearing them talk. So I've heard them talk to a youth group that involved my daughter, and they were saying, "Look, we're here." Not just for the people that you expect we're here for. We're here for everyone. Sometimes it's a one off, sometimes it's a regular ongoing thing, but we're here for everyone. It doesn't have to be just because somebody is unemployed. It could be they might just be in a bit of a sticky situation. It could be all sorts of things. And there's so much thought that goes into how do we make sure that everybody feels welcome and accommodating while still ensuring we're serving who needs us most. It's a
Yeah.
complex subject.
Yeah, it's really complex, and complex in that like specific thing of it's not just complicated, it's actually complex, which means that when we try one thing, they actually don't know what it'll mean. Like, in
Mm,
fact, if we like did more work on securing housing, how would that shift what people needed in terms of food aid?
mm.
So thinking about those intersections, I think is also really part of complexity.
And then going back before that, you obviously you have the book. What inspired the book itself? Like why? What did you always have a book inside you, or was it kind of something that sprung upon you?
Yeah, yeah. So, it was kind of a fun story. So part of my history is that I was at the D school at Stanford for a good long time. Part of it in the early days, and leading what we called the K-12 lab. So this is work we were doing to innovate in the education space. And in the context of that work, I started doing work with school leaders. So in the US, we call them principals, heads of
Mm,
school, etc. And how they could use, we're really focused on how those school leaders could use design and design mindsets to change the culture of their schools. And not just to like fix the Friday night dance, but to actually fix some of the really big underlying problems in
mm,
education. And one of those being the kind of the statistics and the data that we have about racial disparities and racial inequalities in schooling. And what we in this context call, racial equity work. And so we're trying to work on helping educators actually use their design mindsets, which got them primed to be
mm.
creative about problem solving and opportunity seeking. Could they use those mindsets to work on, these equity challenges? And what I found as I started into that work was that sometimes these were leaders that were pretty excited to be using the levers of design and the moves and mindsets of design, but when we tried to bring it to this big issue of racial inequities in their school, they would kind of freeze. Not that they didn't want to attend to it, they cared about it deeply. But I would notice in their kind of affect, they would get kind of technical, where their
Mm.
creativity had been flowing. Suddenly you bring this big topic in, it's like freeze. And I was really intrigued by that and was looking for ways to interrupt and shift that. Like, can't you use your creativity on the biggest challenges that really matter in your school? And so I got introduced by a mentor, Victor Carey, shout out to Victor, um, to the work of John Powell, a scholar who'd been thinking about frameworks around othering and belonging. And what I decided to do as a designer, I was always prototyping the different programs that we were doing with educators. I decided to prototype if I brought 2 pages of this work from John Powell framing othering and belonging, maybe the belonging framework
Mm,
would would help leaders think in some different ways. And what I found was it really did shift what they could do, in part because no matter where they were situated in terms of power and privilege and racial identities, etc., they had likely had an experience of belonging or
mm,
not belonging that they could draw on. And drawing on that kind of opened up like, oh, that's what I'm trying to do with my school culture. I'm trying to have more people feel belonging more of the time. In part because we know that belonging is fundamental to accomplishing anything and it's really fundamental for being a learner. So when we kind of cracked that open, I was just super intrigued on how this frame shift to thinking about belonging
mm,
as the ultimate human goal of working on diversity, equity, and inclusion, like that was really what we were going for. I saw that that worked for people, and so I wanted to share that work. And then kind of around that time, I left my full-time role at the D.school leading these efforts. But the D.school and kind of another stream of work was thinking about publishing, and we gathered a small writers' room
mm,
to start brainstorming different topics. And I think this is just a guess, I should go verify this, but I think that I was probably added to that room because they thought I might wanna write something about my work with educators, kind of
mm,
looking backwards since I had just kind of passed that work on to some others. But I was really intrigued specifically with this notion of belonging and not just kind of illuminating, elucidating the notion of belonging, but actually intersecting it with design, right? And so that's what this book tries to do is talk about belonging and why it matters, venture to show us what some of the specific moments that matter in
mm.
belonging are, and then bring our creativity and kind of the levers of design to say, well, how can you shape it? Because ultimately, belonging is a feeling. Everyone's going to feel it how they feel it. What we can do as designers is
Mm.
try and craft situations where it is more likely to emerge.
That is spot on. Like in our team, we often talk about like behavior nudging. Like how can
Uh
we
huh.
use good
Yeah.
design to encourage people in a direction we'd like them to go? And we talked about this. I talked about this recently with our head of creative, and we talked about restaurants and how a good front of house waiter or waitress would understand that we should fill the window seats first so that the place looks busy, because if the place looks busy and thriving, you're more likely to go in. No one wants to go into a kind of a dead restaurant. And it's all about those tiny little things, which ultimately are different ways of designing an atmosphere and a place of belonging, makes such a difference to what you're doing. One of the first things, I went for a date recently with my wife. We sat down for dinner. We'd got a babysitter, the whole lot. Went in for dinner, sat down, and I instantly went, there's no music on. And the place felt really odd because no one had thought to that level of detail of what should be playing. And those things really do change the sense of where you are. And it's so refreshing to talk to someone who design isn't just making things pretty. Design has a real purpose. And ultimately, it being aesthetically pleasing is a great kind of first intro to something or to someone. But actually, the deeper level is, does it do the thing we need it to do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And the thing about design that you're speaking to there, right? Design is about intentionality. If we're bringing a design lens to something, we're saying, okay, how are we hoping that people feel in this context?
Mm,
And to your point about nudges, what can we craft that helps them in that direction? And the good thing, I think, also about the way I practice design is you're also then thinking about trying things and not knowing if they're gonna work or not, but trying something and then creating them in a way that's safe enough that they could fail and you can notice, "Oh, wow. we thought we were gonna, right, welcome a wide range of people to this context because we were hoping people with really different backgrounds would show up. But it looks like, only the moms of 2-year-olds showed up. Interesting. That means that something about our invitation, our entry, the way we're offering participation, these
Mm,
key moments of belonging were, didn't hit the mark for these other groups, right? We didn't get the dads. We didn't get
mm,
that, and again, in whatever context you're thinking about, they're different folks. And if you're trying to get to a specific group or a range of different groups, you can try something and actually see who shows up, right? We use the expression anyway, people vote with their feet,
mm,
right? That's the like, where do people show up? And that can be in literal spaces like the restaurants you're talking about, or virtual space, right?
mm,
Anything like, where are people showing up? What is that invitation, broadly speaking, right? We rarely get that invitation in the fancy envelope in the mail, but where you metaphorically
mm,
invited or maybe not invited, right? Because that feeling that I think people connect with, and part of what I try to do is invite people to notice, and this is part of design, but it's also part of belonging. When and where do you feel belonging? And then you can start to ask yourself, what was crafted,
mm.
right? So that I could notice that actually they did want me. That if I'm a traveler, was there room for luggage? Oh, they do want travelers here. Right. Kind of a thing.
Or actually, maybe this place isn't for me, and that's okay as well. Maybe this place is more high end and they're not trying to appeal to my audience. And again, that's fine, but it's better to find out beforehand than when you've already got there and gone and you're like, hold on, I'm in a room of plumbers. I thought this was for teachers.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that's that intention of design. Like, who are you actually designing for and what are their needs?
In terms of creating that welcoming atmosphere, whether it's in person or whether it's online, what are some of the things we can do in design to make sure people do feel welcome, especially if maybe we're talking to a slightly more, if we're talking to a diverse range of people, so not people that necessarily are used to being in that space?
Yeah. Well, part of what I like to think about is the particular moments of belonging. And so the things to attend to are the invitation that we've been talking about,
Mm,
the entry, what does it actually feel like to start? What does participation look like?
mm,
What does contributing look like, which is maybe a little bit further along than just participating, but actually contributing? That's a
mm,
very critical moment for belonging. And then another really key one that I think people sometimes don't think about quite as much, but really does matter for belonging, is what I call in the book is dissent. We might also think about it as feedback.
mm,
How is it that you offer? It's another kind of contribution in a way, but how is it that you actively get to say, this is or isn't working for me? And particular, like, how do we, in lots of cultures, it's kind of hard to get to that place of like sharing what's not working, but it really matters for creating belonging. It's actually an important component of belonging if you know that you can say what isn't working for you and that
mm,
there's a way that that gets received
mm,
and taken up.
mhm,
Um, so that's another really important moment of belonging. And then one that I think we sometimes miss, um, because we often focus on the kind of the invitation and the entry. One that sometimes gets missed is what's diverging and exiting. Because we're not all like, when you join something or you start to feel a sense of belonging, it doesn't mean that's forever. Doesn't
yeah,
have to be,
yeah,
right? Some contexts there are, but we need to actually design intentionally for how people come and go,
yeah.
and potentially have still some feelings of belonging attached to that.
For sure. I was talking to someone this morning. We were actually offboarding a client. So, a client who's worked with us for 5 years. And the, basically, it was time for them to kind of find a new partner, which was completely fine. Really great conversation today. And I think sometimes your offboarding or your kind of exit, it says a lot about who you are and how you design that to make it not feel like you're kind of letting go of a grenade, but actually this can work really well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's no reason
Well,
why.
and so how did you do it? What did you design into that?
So we decided that actually what we could supply for them was no longer what they needed. They needed someone who was more flexible, kind of in terms of timings and maybe slightly lower costs.
Uh-huh.
So we found and recommended a really great freelancer for them. We worked with that freelancer to kind of suit their needs, make sure there was chemistry there, make sure it fitted. And then today we had an offboarding meeting where we talked about ideas, what went well, what didn't go well, a little bit like an exit
Yeah.
interview from an employee.
Yeah.
And then we ended up by just being like, look, let's keep in touch. I'm really proud of what you've done. And they said some really kind things back. And actually, I know that they're cheering us on and we're cheering them on. And it's okay that we're no longer working together because we intentionally planned this rather than just kind of launched a grenade into their inbox and hoped everything was going to be okay.
Right. Yeah.
Because it normally isn't. If you're delivering news
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
I think it's time to find other partners. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so that's that, right? Things can go in a belonging direction like that or another direction, right? If you lobbed the grenade, as you say, that would have been a bit of a, right, an othering moment of like, no, we're not, etc. So embracing that as this is a thing to do, and we can design this moment intentionally, just as much as we can design an onboarding kind of moment.
In terms of folk who are listening who maybe run communities, whether in person or maybe whether online, what are some of the things or the levers they could pull to maybe start introducing some of this thinking? So I'm thinking we've got the obvious one of let's talk to your community, let's ask them what they need. But how else can we maybe pull some belonging or design levers to maybe make some like quick wins?
Yeah. So some of the levers, as you say, or levers, as I might say, so it's a classic one. Some of the levers, and part of what I'm doing in the book here is thinking about, okay, we gotta recognize and build some tools around how do we notice and feel belonging. Then the moments that we've been talking about is kind of seeing into belonging, and then I call it shaping belonging, just to get it very general. And some of the things there is, in a lot of contexts, we think that we are more limited than we might really be. The
Hmm.
classic thing is let's have a meeting, or let's have, send an email to invite, or to, right, welcome dissent, or whatever the kind of moment that you're working on is. And so part of what I'm trying to do from a design perspective is open up those levers to say, well, actually, there's space and role and ritual,
Hmm.
events, other kinds of communication beyond email, like to really open that up. And I think that applies to both things that are, in the real world and in the virtual world. Similarly, how is that space being crafted so that somebody can enter, find a way to participate, continue on to contribute, dissent or offer feedback if they need to, leave when they're ready, that space
Hmm.
accommodates those pieces. I think role and ritual are the other ones that I often really like to talk about. And
Hmm.
in online communities, of course, there's lots of different modalities where we think about different kinds of roles of host. But there are also things that are kind of deeper into belonging, of who is your advisor or your coach or
Hmm.
your, right? Is there a particular moment that's happening where everyone is paired up? I was recently doing an in-person workshop, kind of introducing liberatory design. So like design for embodying core values, and this was at the food bank. And instead of just hosting that, kind of from the front of the room as an instructor in a kind of a classic way, people were paired. They're going to do the learning exercise in pairs, but every table with two pairs had a table host. And
Okay.
that host role, right? We think about those in a lot of contexts, but that host role was there to lean into the exercise, offer their own take on what was said globally, etc. So I think often in a lot of contexts, we think of roles as fixed. There's
Mhm.
always been this particular teacher, or this kind of guidance counselor, or this kind of doctor. But in fact, getting creative with roles can be really fruitful. And in
Hmm.
some ways, I think the online community world has helped us to see that,
Hmm.
right? Because it's a little bit easier to set it up, or communities that use some of the more environmental software where you're engaging in different ways and it's super easy. But you also see it in retail environments. Who is the greeter in a store, right? That
Mm.
kind of a role that you may or may not have always had. So I think brainstorming around rules is really fruitful. And then rituals, the notion of, designing with intention and open, a middle, and a close, for instance, becomes super fruitful if things are time based.
I'm kind of obsessed with community and dinner and the overlap that that has. So I think if I'm talking to a client and they're not sure how they could start engaging or building a community around their customer base, my advice is always find your 1% of customers and start a dinner. And the reason why I always think dinners work really well is A, it makes you practice hospitality, and hospitality goes
Yeah.
hand in hand with good community management. But also, most people, not everyone, most people feel comfortable around food. There's a start, there's a middle, there's an end. You know what's going on. And it feels, again, for most people, not everyone, like a safe space. Like you know what's going on. And even if there's a lull in the conversation, you could just talk about the food. And it
Yeah.
works so well to build human interaction without having to, spend months and months planning a conference or an event. It's just get people in a room and just facilitate conversation. Don't lead it,
Yeah.
just facilitate. And it's amazing what happens.
Yeah. So I'm violent agreement here with you, Pete. It's absolutely one of my favorites. And it's a great default for when there's like I often use it when there's a question. So for instance, I was doing some work around belonging in the space of autism care.
Mm,
And this was new, kind of in the medical behavioral health field, new set of clinics that were opening. And they were really trying to think about belonging for staff people because there tended to be kind of a high turnover in the entry level role in
mm,
this ecosystem. And so one of the first things we did was have a dinner. And dinners can be casual, kind of in the way you're describing. You can also bring a level of specificity to it, too. Of in this particular context, what we did is we use the ground rules of what in some contexts is called a Jeffersonian dinner. Apparently, Thomas Jefferson, one of the
mm,
founding folks of the in the U.S., was apparently hard of hearing, and so for him to have a dinner party, he had the rule where you posited one topic of conversation, and you didn't have side chat. You just
mm.
had everybody speak on the topic. And so this and it's really great in lots of contexts. And we did it in this context with these like entry level folks. And the question that we offered was to tell the story of someone who impacted the trajectory of your life.
Mhm,
And there were funny stories, there were heartbreaking stories, there were tears shed, and everybody learned something about each other. And, the container itself is this is confidential. You're not going to go talking about this at work. You're not going to tell other people.
mm,
But for that meal, that dinner, it was really, it shifted how everybody was able to show up. And we know that it created a kind of belonging then in terms of participation for that team and for that company. And then we like doing that. So we also were doing some work around belonging for family members because an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis shifts some expectations that family members had about how their kid was going to go to school and what those
mm,
things were going to look like. And it's right, it's like a shock to the family system, and then how to help those families find a new sense of belonging different than what they might have been imagining. And so hosted some similar style dinners for families so that they could get to know each other in that way. So just to say, absolutely, like a brilliant starting point in terms of an event or a mechanism to use is a meal for all the reasons you stated.
And when everyone came in, did you then explain kind of the ground rules and the tone? Is that how you kick things off?
Yeah, so we did it at the kickoff, and we also did it ahead of time
Yeah.
because recognizing like lots of kinds of learners,
Yeah.
right? Some people, if they just walked in and were told, actually, tonight we're doing it like this, would have been
Yeah.
like, whoa, what the heck? And so sharing the formality of it ahead of time is really helpful for some people. Some people, doesn't matter, they'll flow with it, whatever, but
Yeah.
like it's nice. And again, that's a move that you're making to try and help everyone feel like that entry and their
Hmm.
ability to participate has been attended to. So sharing in advance the kind of ground rules, which are simple, that right? They're like, we're gonna have this conversation. We'll talk one at a time. You'll tell a 3 to 5 minute story.
Yep.
You don't There's no pressure to say anything you don't want to say. And it'll feel a little different, but we'll have a chance to debrief it at the end. Right.
And
And invariably there are some people who are like, why do we have to do it like this? And at the end,
yeah.
the response is like, wow, that was so cool, because you're so used to jumping in
Mm.
to like add on, oh, me too, and blah, 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 blah. And you don't do this in this context, right? You tell your story. And then if there's silence before the next person tells their story, which again is not building on your story, but is just a next story, it's just enough different from a regular dinner party that it really helps people notice that you're trying to do something. They're actually trying to learn about each other in a new way.
It's amazing how just setting the tone and setting the expectations of the people in the room really has a difference. I've been to large events where that's set and where it isn't, and it's so different. So my favorite conferences to go to are when they start with, hey, we're here to be welcoming, we're here to swap stories, not business cards. This is what this event's about. This is what we expect you to get out of it. This is how we expect you to behave. And it's almost just like, right, we're all in on this now. We're all agreed. If you see someone by themselves, maybe say hello to them. Like, it just kind of sets the tone. Where I think if you let everybody kind of just decide it, then you're letting them make the culture. You're not letting them make the culture. You're letting them set the trajectory of that event. And actually, as the person who's designed the event and thought about it for the last however long, you should be the person who kind of lays that out, I think. And again, I think that's just good hospitality.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and for me, from design, it's like whether you're going with the default design or an intentional design.
Yes.
Right? Default versus intent, I think is kind of what we're talking about. And that in a lot of contexts is really important too, just from a racial justice perspective, because the default design is often from 30 years ago from some old white dudes who, right? Like we just, inherited
Yeah.
unexplainably, seemingly, although we do know how those things were set up, but like we're right, our default design is not necessarily what we're wanting to do moving forward.
Yeah.
And so if you're trying to invite new folks, different folks, have people be able to work across difference and build trust, you really have to do it intentionally.
When you're thinking about a new project or a new problem or a new thing which you're looking at coming at from a belonging or design point of view, how important is it that the leadership involved have got crystal clear mission and values laid out to work with?
Well, I always think that's the best case scenario, and
Hmm.
it's just not always where people are.
Hmm.
I think in the social sector, there's like can sometimes be like more of a focus on that, which I find really helpful. I'm also really interested in when people have values, like that can be grounding,
Mm.
and is some I don't wanna say often, it can sometimes be, it's on the wall or it's in some document, but it's
Sure.
not really lived.
Lived. Yeah.
So I love helping people think about how to embody values,
Mm.
and design is a really fun and effective way to do that. Because again, you can kind of open up those levers and say, "Wow, what are all the ways that we could express this value?" And also, how can we design for it to show up on the daily?
Mm.
Or to your point in this particular event? How, right? What's the value that we really want to come through? And then it becomes, almost like a rubric to be like looking at the design. Say you're designing a 2-day event, looking at the design of the 2 days and asking, how has that value of accountability, let's say,
Mm,
really shown up? And can we get creative about that? Oh, maybe we want to do a role that is like everybody gets an accountability buddy, right? Which is that, right? And we put into the flow of the day 3 different times where you check in with your accountability buddy,
mm,
for instance. Or maybe there's some kind of ritual where we ring a bell at a certain time and you just take 3 minutes to ground and think about whatever the value is that we're focused on. So I think there are lots of ways to get creative
mm.
about helping values to show up, because what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about mission and values is I don't want that to be a thing that is just held by leadership. I
Yes.
want that to be a thing, right, that everyone is working to embody and bring alive across the work.
In what you've said through our conversations, you've used the word like design in lots of ways, but at no time have we spoken about graphic design. And it almost feels
Right.
like graphic design has stolen the title of design, where you talked a moment again about designing a program, right? Designing what the event's going to look like, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And in some ways,
Experience design, right?
yeah, it
Yeah.
does. And it feels
Yeah.
in many ways that like designing a logo or a brochure has almost like stolen that job title. And I think the title of the book, Design for Belonging, almost is like we're recapturing that, because design should, whether you're an accountant or whether you're a plumber, there's design involved, whether or not you're opening Photoshop or not, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to say, like, I'm not a formally trained designer. I came to design through my desire to understand how people learn and creating learning environments. So if I'm any kind of official designer, I'm a learning experience designer. And you're right. And I think for a while too, like graphic design kind of felt like that was the default definition of design,
Mm,
or visual design more broadly, or almost a moment too, I think, where colloquially maybe web design, right,
yes.
owned the design space. So I really, and the work of the D School at Stanford has really been about lifting up the mindsets and modes of design, so that all kinds of people in all kinds of roles can own those ways of moving, which is to say, right, from a liberatory design perspective, who is most impacted by the thing that we're working on? Who has lived experience, and how can we work together to understand the context in which we're working?
Mm,
And then how can we get to a creative space where we think beyond what's currently known? If we're trying to use design for innovation, we have to get beyond what's known. And there's so many mechanisms within design to do that, to generate ideas, to imagine, and be creative. And then the other piece I think that's really important to notice, that's part of all kinds of design, is the notion of safe to fail experiments, of trying something out
mm.
and seeing if it worked or not.
And a lot of that comes through great leadership, and I guess bravery in your culture.
Yeah. Well, and I think of this way that we're talking about design here, as critical to leadership. I think design is an approach to leadership,
Mhm.
which is saying, like, what are we working with? What do we need to do? And how do we open up to craft new ways to do it? Um, yeah, it's a kind of facilitative, adaptive leadership that I think can come from using the mindsets and modes of design.
Susie, I think that's the perfect place to finish. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with me today, but also speaking at CMX and constantly sharing your thoughts and insights. And yeah, no, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you so much. It was a really fun conversation.
If anyone wanted to reach out, obviously they can grab the book at various bookshops online. But is there a good place to find you online? Is it LinkedIn? Is there a website? Is it Twitter, etc.?
Sure, sure. So definitely on LinkedIn, on On Twitter. I guess we call it X now. That's at Susie Wise on X,
Yeah.
Susie Wise on LinkedIn. And there is a website for the book, and there's also a free downloadable toolkit in kind of a different visual language at designforbelonging.com. And then also just really want to say that this book is part of a series of designer guides
Mhm.
out of the D.school at Stanford. So check out dschool.stanford.edu as well.
Thank you so much, Susie. Hope you have a really good rest of your day, and hopefully we'll chat again at some point in the future.
Thanks so much. That's great.
We are Steadfast Collective. We exist to craft digital applications that bring people together. A team of smart creatives, we are excited by technology, and we always aim to leave the internet in a better place than we found it. Working with many of the UK's leading communities, we use technology as an accelerator to help them grow and engage their members. Our applications resource membership organisations, grow businesses, and create value. We know what it takes to ship, market, and scale applications, and we apply this wealth of background knowledge to everything we do. We're not just another agency, we are community builders.